The important thing to remember about cooking meat is that there are no guarantees. No matter what a recipe tells you, or a theory like searing seals in the juices, there's no substitute for checking the doneness yourself early and often. One trick for heating a pan up to a good high temperature for searing is to cover it with a piece of aluminum foil. The foil reflects the escaping heat back onto the pan surface and it heats up much faster. It's important to let the pan heat up long enough, not only just to get hot, but for that heat to even out. And then it's time to put on the meat. It helps to push down on the meat as it's cooking to increase the contact between the meat surface and the pan surface, which is going to get that browning, that searing going even faster and more evenly, because some parts will shrink away from the surface and those parts won't get as brown as the rest. Searing meat actually makes it more likely that you're going to end up with a less juicy piece of meat because it's a very high temperature process. So searing a piece of meat is a good idea, not because it seals in the juices, but because it creates great flavor. That's the reason to sear meat. At this point, I'm going to move the meat from the stove top to the oven. We do want to cook the outside of the meat at a high temperature to get that flavor development, but then we want to slow the cooking down so that as the meat cooks through, it doesn't cook through too quickly. We're trying to hit a very narrow range of temperatures inside that piece of meat, between maybe 130 and 150 degrees. The steak is done about now. We can take it out. It's been well seared on both sides, still has moisture, still has juiciness, that wonderful succulent flavor, the kind of thing you can only get from a piece of meat that's been properly cooked. No matter how wonderful the food is that we buy, by the time we actually get around to cooking with it, it's been sitting around for a while. And when food sits around, its surfaces suffer because they've been in contact with the air. It's important to keep that in mind and refresh foods by removing those compromised surfaces. And a great example of that is butter. The surface of butter gets rancid very easily and very quickly, even if it's wrapped in a box with foil or wax paper. And if you taste a little bit of that surface, if you scrape it off, which is the way to freshen it, you can see the color changes. And if you taste this by itself, it's awful, it's rancid. You don't want it. And so whenever you use butter, freshen it up, take some off the surface and get down to the fresh. Meats. Whenever we cut into a piece of meat, we expose more surface area to the air, and that surface begins to get old. So whenever we work with meat, we want to refresh it as much as possible, especially if it's been sitting around for a couple of days in the fridge. And there are a couple of ways to do that depending on how the meat has been handled. You want to scrape away any visible debris, any visible discoloration, and then you want to rinse it in tap water and then blot it off. Smell it to make sure it smells reasonably fresh, and then go on from there. Keep that in mind and scrape off the surface that's been exposed to the air. Get down to the fresh food. Cooking pasta. Usually that means filling a huge pot with lots and lots of water, waiting forever to bring that water to the boil, putting the pasta in and having it stick as it goes in and having to wrestle it apart. None of that is really necessary. Instead, you can simply take dry pasta, put it in a not that large a pot, add not that much water to it, just enough to cook it. Because the water is cold, it's not going to stick. Spread it apart, put it on the stove, and in 10-15 minutes it'll be just as good as when it's done the old-fashioned way. And it's good to remember that fish is one of the most perishable foods we have. So it's important to take some extra care when you pick it out. If you're buying pieces of fish, you want them to look as moist and fresh as possible, with no gaping between the segments of the fish muscle. If you possibly can, get fish whole. And there what you're looking for are bright eyes, eyes that still look alive, full of light, a skin that's glossy and taut, no signs of wrinkling, and if you can, try to get a glimpse of the gills. They should still be nice and red. Ask for extra ice to take the fish home. If you can, take it home in a cooler, and that'll give you the best quality when you finally get the fish to your table. I'm here at the market buying vegetables, and there are some great looking mushrooms and eggplants. Those are notoriously leaky vegetables. They lose a lot of water when you cook them. But it turns out that you can use that to make two very different kinds of dishes. So I'm going to grab some, take them home, and let's see what we can do. Mushrooms and eggplants are especially wet, porous vegetables. And there are various ways you can deal with that. I want to show you two. The standard one is to put them into a very hot pan with a fair amount of oil. The vegetables took up all the oil I gave them. The pan is nice and hot. There aren't too many vegetables. There's plenty of oil to lubricate them. And so they're sauteing nicely. So the vegetables are just about done. They're going to have a wonderfully full, rich flavor. We've cooked these the way most books tell you to cook vegetables like this, not letting them stew in their own juices. Now I'm going to cook these leaky vegetables in a way that most cookbooks tell us not to see what happens. So I'm going to crowd this pan with these vegetables. Most cookbooks tell us not to do that, but in fact you can get something very useful and interesting to happen if you do. That's a crowded pan. The pan is cold. I haven't started heating it yet. I haven't put any oil in yet. I'm just going to put the lid on and turn on the heat. So these vegetables are stewing in their juices, just as cookbooks warn us against. It turns out that's not such a bad thing. And so what I'm going to do now, I'm going to turn the heat up and leave the lid off. Notice how much they've shrunk. They used to be piled up to here, and now they've gone way down. The juices are kind of flavoring them from outside. In a few minutes, I'll add just a little bit of oil, saute them at the very end, and they'll end up as delicious as these vegetables cooked the old-fashioned way, but with much less oil. A lot of the vegetables here at the market are really great just boiled. Boiling is probably the simplest cooking technique there is. But even with something that simple, there are a few keys that can make a big difference. One of them is getting the vegetables cooked as quickly as possible, because as they're cooking, enzymes are beginning to do damage. You want to knock them out as quickly as possible. So what that means is starting with a large pot of very hot water at a rolling boil. The vegetables are going to cool the water down, and you want it to come back to temperature as quickly as possible. You also want to add a fair amount of salt, because that's going to help prevent the vegetables from leaching out a fair amount of their nutrients and their flavor. Then we add the vegetables, put the lid back on, but ajar, because you don't want the pot to boil over. Okay, the beans are done. We're going to take them out. Okay. Of course, you notice they're freshly cooked. They're steaming. Steaming means that they're losing moisture. You can prevent that moisture loss simply by coating them with something that's waterproof, and that's a little bit of oil or butter. That prevents wrinkling, and it keeps the moisture and the goodness inside the beans.